Hello, everybody. Welcome to all of you joining us today online for the ASRI Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Liz Williams, and I am an ASRI Graduate Student Fellow and a SSHRC doctoral candidate in environmental psychology at the University of Victoria. We would like to acknowledge the generous funding by the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights, Law, and Policy for this lecture series. Thanks also to our co-presenters at the University of Victoria for this lecture, the Faculty of Law, the Departments of Political Science and Environmental Studies, and the Center for Global Studies. We are welcoming a wide range of participants to today's lecture from several different countries. Thank you for joining us from all of your time zones. We're excited to have you here today. Today, we welcome Professor Stacy Banwell from the University of Greenwich, presenting under the title, Protecting Non-Human Animals from Ecological Destruction. Should we introduce the crime of animal ecocide? Dr. Banwell is Professor of Criminology at the University of Greenwich and also postgraduate academic portfolio lead at the School of Law and Criminology. Her research interests include conflict-related sexual and reproductive violence, gender, climate change, and atrocity crimes, and multi-species justice. Professor Banwell is writing her third monograph, An Intersectional Analysis of Climate Change and Atrocity Crimes, Life on Earth is in Crisis. She is co-PI on the EU Horizon UKRI project, Transformative Change for Biodiversity and Equity, looking at rights of nature, ecocide, and legal personhood. We will have time following her lecture for a question and answer period, so please post your questions in the chat and I will order those and read them out. So with warm welcome to you, I will now turn the mic over to you, Dr. Banwell.
Thanks so much, Liz. Okay, so as Liz said, the title of my lecture this evening is Protecting Non-Human Animals from Ecological Destruction. Should we introduce the crime of animal ecocide? So let me run through what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to start by talking about industrialized animal agriculture and the link between that and climate change. Then I'm going to talk about the impact of climate change on non-human animals. Then I'm going to run through the definition of the crime of ecocide, what the aims are, what the limitations and criticisms are. Then I'm going to focus on my specific criticisms, which is the anthropocentric and speciesist thinking, which I think underpins the current definition of ecocide. And then I'm going to finish by thinking about how can we better protect nature and the environment as well as non-human animals if we think about ways of revising that definition. And that leads me to this question around whether we should introduce the crime of ecocide. So as I say, let's start by outlining the relationship between industrialized animal agriculture and climate change. So Millman states, the global production of food is responsible for 1/3 of all planet heating gases emitted by human activity, with the use of animals for meat causing twice the pollution of producing plant-based foods. This is corroborated by Rust, who says, the majority of animal scientists and livestock producers are fully aware and accept that that livestock production sector contributes to factors causing climate change, and that in turn livestock production will also be affected by climate change. I think that's something that I'm particularly interested in, this idea that it is responsible for climate change, but also if we think about the animal industrial complex, I want to think about the harm then that is done to non-human animals. So we have this circular relationship, if you like. So the animal industrial complex comprises large industrial farms where non-human animals are raised at high density for the consumption of meat, eggs, and dairy. They are referred to as concentrated animal feeding operations in the US, and we refer to them as mega farms in the UK. And these mega facilities emit greenhouse gas emissions, which have implications for climate change. I'm just going to give you a bit more information about these facilities. So to qualify as a concentrated animal feeding operation, these facilities need to hold at least 125,000 broiler chickens, 82,000 laying hens, 2,500 pigs, and in some cases this can be as many as 10,000 pigs, 700 dairy cows, and 1,000 beef cattle. As I say, mega farms are the British equivalent, and in the UK there are 800. To qualify, the farm must include facilities that can detain more than 40,000 birds, 2,000 pigs, or 750 breeding sows. It is estimated that globally greenhouse gas emissions from factory farming comprise 14.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Research conducted by Nature Food found that livestock production, as well as livestock feed, is responsible for 57% of all food production emissions. So greenhouse gas emissions stem from manure management practices, the use of fossil fuels to manage the temperature of the facilities, as well as to run the facilities, the way non-human animals are processed and packaged, and the digestive processes of certain non-human animals with specialist digestive systems, cows, for example. So put simply, the global agricultural industry contributes to climate change through greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the first thing that we need to establish. The second point I want to focus on then is what is the impact of climate change that is caused by the animal industrial complex on non-human animals. So various scholars who have addressed the impact of climate change on the welfare and mortality of non-human animals can be divided into two categories. The first are those who consider the impact of non-human animals within animal agriculture, so those that are housed in factory farms. But there are also those who address the impact of climate change on free-living or wild non-human animals. So let's start with the former. So research has highlighted the impact of extreme weather events such as floods, heat waves, and storms on farm animals. And according to reports from farmers, for example, sheep flocks, who mainly graze on hillsides and are therefore exposed to extreme weather, suffer from hypothermia, which is a major cause of death. Death from heat exhaustion during heat waves is another area of concern, and this is due to poor ventilation inside sheds and transport trucks. So pigs and chickens are particularly vulnerable to this because they are unable to sweat. In fact, in 2022, it was reported that millions of chickens died due to heat exhaustion inside sheds where temperatures reached a high of 45 degrees Celsius. During that same year, there were reports of pigs dying in transit due to heat stress. Heat stress can also impact the immune system of non-human animals, which increases their susceptibility to pathogens and diseases. And lastly, non-human animals die due to storms, and that's the image that you can see here in relation to Storm Anwen in 2021. So when we think about non-human animals who die in storms, we're talking about two examples I'm talking about here, which is the heavy snowfall that occurred during Storm Emma in the northwest of England in 2018, which trapped and killed hundreds of farmed non-human animals. And then likewise, heavy snow during Storm Arwen in 2021 also trapped and killed farmed non-human animals. And that's the image you can see there. Flooding caused by hurricane also poses a risk to non-human animals. So the image that you can see here is of the World Animal Protection, who are providing care and medical treatment to cows, goats, chicken, and pets who are all impacted by Hurricane Matthew. So as Jared reports, in 2016, Hurricane Matthew hit Haiti and the southeastern United States. As a result, thousands of pigs and millions of chickens drowned in waste-ridden floodwaters. Contaminated floodwaters went beyond designated factory farmland and drained into the ocean, harming marine life and nearby groundwater sources, subsequently hurting communities who rely on wells for water. And we'll return to this issue later on, the impact that these extreme weather events or ecological destruction can have on both human and non-human populations. And as we know, in the past month, Hurricane Helene, a Category 4 storm, has led to devastation across Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee. The storm has killed hundreds of people, but has also caused the death of thousands of non-human animals. So as reported by the World Animal Protection in the US, animals caught in the fury of the storm, especially farm animals, have little to no chance of survival when they are abandoned in cages or confined to industrial sheds. They continue. Factory farms in particular have have become a tragic scene of mass casualties as floods and high winds tore through the rural areas where many of these facilities are located. The World Animal Protection US also goes on to talk about the fact we don't quite know how many non-human animals have been killed during this hurricane, but they believe that it is similar to the amount that died during Hurricane Florence in North Carolina in 2018. And during that hurricane, 3.4 million chickens and turkeys, along with 5,500 pigs, were killed as a result of that hurricane. This is because the animals were left behind in factory farms where they were unable to escape rising floodwaters, or they died due to the structural collapse of the facilities that they were detained in. So as I mentioned at the start, we think about these mega farms and these CAFOs where we have non-human animals who are confined in these cramped facilities. It means that they are very vulnerable when we have extreme weather events or hurricanes or floods where they are unable to escape. So one final comment from the World Animal Protection US is evacuations for farm animals, especially on the scale needed for industrial farming operations, are rarely part of emergency plans. And as a result, millions of animals are left to suffer and perish in conditions that could have been prevented. But it's not just factory farmland that is impacted by extreme weather events. The habitats of free-living or wild non-human animals are also negatively impacted by floods, drought, heavy snow, and/or heat waves. Almiron and Faraya identify the following threats to free-living non-human animals as a result of climate change or climatic weather events. So the first is higher temperatures. So this can impact the food habitats of free-living or wild animals. Melting ice and snow, which then leads to competition for food and territory. Ocean acidification, which has dire consequences for marine organisms. Warmer weather, which impacts all gill-breathing species, and rising sea levels, which results in changes to salinity, which can then impact the reproduction and survival of many fishes and shellfishes. Wildfires are also an issue for free-living non-human animals and can be fatal. I think one of the most well-known examples of this were the Australian bushfires during 2019 and 2020, which killed or harmed 3 billion non-human animals. At least 33 people were also killed during these wildfires. In February 2020, the Australian government identified 130 animal species which needed urgent help following the bushfires. Almost all of those non-human animals on that list had lost 30% of their habitat as a result of these bushfires. Likewise, heat waves can be fatal for free-living non-human animals. For example, during the 2021 heat wave in Western Canada, an estimated 1 billion shellfish cooked inside their shells. And during the 2022 heat wave in the UK, dehydration led to the deaths of various wildlife. Heat waves are also occurring in the oceans, killing corals, kelpfish, and seagrass meadows. So before we move on to the next section about thinking about what is the response to this, I want to end with this grave statement by Lindwell, who notes, half of all animal species in the world's most biodiverse places, like the Amazon rainforest or the Galapagos Islands, are at risk of extinction from climate change. Okay, so let's consider what steps are being taken to address some of the impacts of climate change. So ecocide is defined by the independent expert panel as unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment caused by those acts. This independent expert panel go on to list 5 key terms within this definition. So these are wanton, severe, widespread, long-term, and the environment. And it is worth pausing here for a moment just to run through some of these. My criticisms and concern will focus mainly on this first issue, which is the wanton element contained within this definition. So wanton means with reckless disregard for damage which would be clearly excessive in relation to the social and economic benefits anticipated. The second key term is severe. This means damage which involves very serious adverse changes, disruption or harm to any element of the environment, including grave impacts on human life or natural, cultural, or economic resources. Widespread means damage which extends beyond a limited geographic area, crosses state boundaries, or is suffered by an entire ecosystem or species or a large number of human beings. And we will come back to that later on. Long-term means damage which is irreversible or which cannot be redressed through natural recovery within a reasonable period of time. And finally, environment, as defined by this expert panel when they were thinking about the definition of ecocide, refers to the Earth, its biosphere, cryosphere, lithosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere, as well as outer space. So the goal of Stop Ecocide International, the Stop Ecocide Foundation, is to add ecocide to the Rome Statute of the International Court, where it will sit alongside other core international crimes, such as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. It will therefore be considered an atrocity crime. The aim is to use international criminal law, the only international legal system that focuses on individual responsibility, to hold individual actors to account for crimes against the environment. At present, despite efforts to add ecocide to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, there is no internationally recognised crime of ecocide. However, nationally, several countries have or are seeking to make ecocide a crime. So Belgium was the first European country to recognise ecocide under international law. The crime applies to individuals in the highest positions of decision-making and applies to kind of corporations as well. Punishment for the crime would include a 20-year prison sentence or a 1.6 million euro fine. Mexico, drawing on this definition that you can see on the screen here, submitted a bill in 2023 to its parliament to criminalise ecocide. Brazil has also proposed an ecocide bill. Other states that have also criminalised ecocide include Vietnam, Ukraine, and Russia, while several other European countries have submitted draft laws. I think it's interesting to think about Russia being included in that list, given current reports that Russia is using ecocide as a weapon of war during the against Ukraine. There was an interesting article, I don't know if people saw this, perhaps we can discuss it later on, but there was an interesting article in The Conversation earlier this month where the authors outlined the deliberate destruction to dams in Ukraine, which has caused floods, damaged ecosystems, forests, and have left people without drinking water. And this has been described as a deliberate attempt by Russia to damage the environment. So the authors state, dam burst killed at least 400 Ukrainian civilians, flooded some 4,000 homes and displaced over 4,000 people. The report also points to extensive damage to the region's ecosystem, including its fishing industry. So over 11,000 tons of fish were lost, some 11,000 hectares of forest were also destroyed by the floods, and at the same time, following the dam's destruction during the war, almost 1 million people were left without drinking water. One main criticism levelled at ecocide is this notion of, or this lack of enforcement, and this poses a significant problem. For example, in Guatemala, despite legally recognising ecocide and finding a palm oil corporation guilty of damaging waterways and associated ecosystems, the corporation has resumed polluting the river despite this initial ruling. So we don't have time to go into all of the various criticisms of ecocide. I'm going to focus on this kind of lingering anthropocentrism and speciesism within the definition. And this forms the basis of my main reservation of this, is that it reproduces anthropocentric thinking, which in this context prioritizes the human cost of climate change at the expense of recognizing the harm that is incurred by the more than human world. Indeed, despite the potential of ecocide to move towards a bio or ecocentric understanding of human nature relationships, the wanton element contained within that definition precludes any transformative potential the crime the crime of ecocide could have. So before I continue, I thought it might be helpful just to pause here, just so I can run through some of these worldviews pertaining to people-nature relationships that I've just referred to. So these can be placed within three broad categories. The first is anthropocentrism, the second is bio or ecocentrism, and the third is a pluriversal worldview, or a pluricentric worldview. So those who espouse an anthropocentric worldview, as I've stated, prioritize humans and emphasize human superiority over other species. Conversely, bio or ecocentric worldviews appreciate the value of nature for its intrinsic worth, rather than what value it brings to humans. These approaches, this kind of ecocentric and biocentric approach, do not see or regard the needs of humans as superior to those of the more than human world. And finally, pluriversal worldviews celebrate and promote reciprocal, intertwined, and embedded relationships between humans and other beings. So we can align this pluriversal worldview with indigenous philosophies, which recognize the interrelationality between human and more than human species. It's worth noting that this anthropocentric bias is not limited to the crime of ecocide. It can also be found in a number of UN policy documents and statements. So, for example, in her opening statement to the 42nd session of the Human Rights Council, Michelle Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, made the following statement. She said, "Climate change is a reality that now affects every region of the world. The human implications of currently projected levels of global heating are catastrophic. Storms are rising and tides could submerge entire islands, nations, and coastal cities. Fires rage through our forest and the ice is melting. We are burning up our future, literally." This message around the kind of human impacts of climate change is also reiterated on the website of the Human Rights Council. Furthermore, in line with the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights promises to adopt a human rights-based approach to climate action. So to that end, the Human Rights Council has adopted a number of resolutions to address climate change and human rights. So these developments are welcome because they are acknowledging that there is a climate crisis. However, my concern is that this human rights approach fails to acknowledge the harm of climate change to ecosystems and to non-human animals and to this kind of broader, more than human world. So let's sort of focus in on this wantonness element contained within the definition of ecocide, which really illustrates this anthropocentric thinking and which reinforces dichotomies between humans and nature. So the wantonness criteria included in the definition of ecocide only concerns itself with actions that are considered in excess to social and economic benefits resulting from certain actions. This means that it will exclude any actions that do not meet this threshold. In other words, the cost to the environment is deemed secondary to the benefits of humans. To put it bluntly, the wantonness element of this crime undermines its central tenet, which is to punish those who commit environmental crimes that result in the destruction of the earth. As Heller notes, who is quite scathing in his criticism of this element of ecocide, the wantonness element has no place in the definition of ecocide. How, he continues, the independent expert panel can justify calling such an anthropocentric understanding of environmental destruction ecocide is difficult to understand. Instead, he proposes that ecocide should be defined as acts committed with awareness that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts, where a reasonable person would know that the expected environmental damage would be clearly excessive in relation to the social and economic benefits anticipated. So for me, if we start to think about the anthropocentric nature of the crime of ecocide, and if we're starting to think about anthropocentric understandings of nature and the environment, this to me leads inexorably to the following questions. What do we mean by the environment, particularly when we're thinking about this definition of ecocide? What types of nature within this environment are we protecting? And what about non-human animals? So just to reiterate, the independent expert panel defines the environment within the definition of ecocide as the Earth, its biosphere, cryosphere, lithosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere, as well as outer space. For me, this kind of qualification that they provide in that definition of what the term environment means is paradoxically both precise and vague. It certainly feels very scientific, reductive, quite abstract. Indeed, this account of the environment is at odds with indigenous understandings and interactions with nature, which are much more rooted in relationality and an ethics of care. There's a spiritual relationship that indigenous and place-based people have with nature, where there is respect and kinship for nature, and where protecting and preserving the environment is of paramount concern. And that seems to me to be very at odds with this kind of definition provided by the expert panel in relation to their definition of environment as contained in the crime of ecocide. So that led me to start thinking about whether we can look elsewhere for a more robust understanding of what we mean by the environment when we're talking about ecological destruction and we're talking about protecting nature and we're talking about, criminalizing acts that damage the environment. We don't have space to talk about all of the academic literature that has been written about, what we mean by the term nature, what we mean by the term environment. But for our purposes here, I think it's quite helpful to draw on the definition of the natural environment as outlined in the UK Environmental Act. And this includes living elements of the environment, so plants, wild animals, other living organisms and their habitats. It does not include domesticated animals such as livestock and pets. But the definition of the natural environment as contained within the UK Environmental Act does include non-living elements such as air, water and land. I would revise this definition so that domesticated non-human animals, so pets and livestock, are not excluded, and that any harm to the natural environment considers the impact on all living and non-living elements, and where relevant, their habitats. In fact, I believe that more attention needs to be paid to the impacts of climate change for non-human animals. So having spent some time outlining my reservations around one of the first criticisms I have of the definition of ecocide, that is its anthropocentric focus, I want to focus on a second issue, which is the omission of non-human animals from that definition. If we think back to all those examples that I gave at the start about the harm and damage and death of non-human animals as a result of climate change, it seems to me that it is important that they would be considered in any definition of a crime that seeks to punish those who damage the environment or damage the earth. So despite reference to widespread damage to entire ecosystems or species, there is no explicit reference to non-human animals within the current definition of ecocide. So far I've outlined the ways in which ecological destruction and its knock-on effects in the form of climatic weather events has negative implications for non-human animals. So while I believe that the definition of the natural environment as outlined in that environmental law is an improvement on the definition provided by the independent expert panel, neither adequately address the impact of anthropogenic climate change on non-human animals. So just to reiterate, the current definition of the natural environment environmental law does not include pets or livestock. Likewise, the definition of the environment provided by the independent expert panel does not explicitly reference non-human animals. However, interestingly, in the early days of discussion around introducing the crime of ecocide, Higgins Short and South did consider the impact of non-human animals. So they wrote an article in 2013 called Protecting the Planet, a Proposal for a Law of Ecocide. And in it, they did argue that cases of environmental harms should include crimes and harms against animals and non-human species. They explain, abuse, mistreatment, or death of animals and birds may be visible and stark, as in the cases of destructions of habitats by war, catastrophe, oil spills, deforestation, or be less visible and socially accepted when relating to farming, medical experiments, clearance of land for building, or where damage results from activities that cause air or water pollution, soil erosion, or climate change. Now, interestingly, here they were talking about crimes and harms against non-human animals that should form part of our understanding of environmental harms. Other writers described this or classified what Higgins et al. Was saying as animal ecocide. So Leger and Bruman, while they kind of accepted this definition or commended Higgins et al. For their work, they found that what they were proposing was lacking. And just to sort of describe the image that you can see here, so this is an image of a pile of American bison skulls that are waiting to be ground for fertilizer. And I think it really captures this idea of the killing of non-human animals. So we have Higgins et al. Who talk about the harms to non-human animals, which need to be considered as part of our understanding of environmental harms. Leger and Bruman argue that this is a type of animal ecocide. What Higgins et al. Were describing was animal ecocide. However, they found it slightly wanting, and they offer the following definition of animal ecocide to address this limitation that they found in the work of Higgins et al. So they say animal ecocide is the unnecessary killing or slaughter of a wild or wild-caught animal by any human agency, or allowing such killing or slaughter to be so caused by any governmental organization to such an extent that an animal or a group of animals lose their sentient capacity to live a natural life according to their species. The authors go on to list various examples then of highly sentient non-human animals. So, for example, they refer to whales and dolphins, who, by virtue of their superior sentience, should be spared unnecessary killing or slaughter. So while I agree with the authors of the importance of the crime of animal ecocide, in fact, I hadn't come across this term until I read their work, my understanding of how this crime, of what this crime would entail and how it would work and what protections it would offer non-human animals differs from their proposal. So first, I would not create a hierarchy of animal sentience. If the crime of animal ecocide is to exist, I believe it should apply to all sentient non-human animals. It would apply to any species of non-human animal who is impacted by any damage to the environment. So while my focus in this talk today is on the harms incurred to non-human animals within industrialized animal agriculture, I think the principle of my argument, that is the need to draw on a revised definition of the natural environment, one that includes all living and non-living entities, can be applied more broadly. So this is how I would envisage the process would work if we're thinking about this idea of animal ecocide. We would start by granting legal personhood to non-human animals who are currently held under conditions of coercive confinement. So our focus here is on non-human animals held captive on factory farms. Legal personhood would mean replacing the current status of non-human animals as things or property with their status as legal persons. Following Kirky, I believe that non-human animals should be granted passive incidents of legal personhood, which would mean they have the right not to be harmed, the right to personal freedom, liberty, and bodily integrity. It's worth noting that whilst non-human animals may hold some incidents of legal personhood, so for example, through animal welfare statutes, for example, they are not currently regarded as full legal persons. So once recognized as legal persons, I believe non-human animals should be released from captivity. And this is quite a bold statement. So if anyone is interested in exploring the practicalities and the feasibilities of this, I come across two really interesting pieces of work that speak to this. The first is an article written by Seth Milstein, and the title of his article is If Factory Farm Ended, What Would Happen to All the Animals? It might be a faraway scenario, but it's one worth examining. And the other article is by Hazel Healy, which is titled, What If We Banned the Intensive Farming of Animals? So they're just two really interesting articles that think through what would happen if we were to free all non-human animals from factory farms. So let's return to this issue of releasing non-human animals from captivity. This speaks to deniers' notion of non-speciesist law. And under this law, it would be illegal to hold non-human animals captive. So this would result in dismantling of the industrialized animal agriculture, which in turn would reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reduce the impacts of climate change. Second, the current understanding of the term environment within the definition of ecocide needs to explicitly address harms to non-human animals. This harm, I believe, is incurred either through acts of ecological destruction, so through deforestation or oil spills, or through extreme weather events caused by anthropogenic climate change. So I lean more towards the definition of crimes and harms against animals that was provided by Higgins et al. However, I offer the following revised account of harms to non-human animals when the crime of ecocide occurs. So I think about this in terms of the harm and death of non-human animals or species whose habitats have been destroyed as a result of ecological destruction. And this could include oil spills, deforestation, or land appropriation and dispossession. Or we're talking about the death or harm of non-human animals through environmental harms caused by climate change that impact the health, well-being, or mortality of non-human animals, and that can be through extreme weather events such as droughts, floods, and heat waves, which I discussed at the beginning of this lecture. So I'm going to close this session by thinking about how we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also what shifts in our thinking are required for us to achieve this. So let's start with the latter. And here I think it's helpful to draw on Gruen's notion of entangled empathy, which is an alternative ethic for our relationships with non-human animals. So she describes or defines entangled empathy as a type of caring perception focused on attending to another's experience of well-being, an experiential process involving a blend of emotion and cognition in which we recognize we are in relationships with others and are called upon to be responsive and responsible in those relationships by attending to another's needs, interests, desires, vulnerabilities, hopes, and sensitivities. So I think this is a good starting point. I think this is a good way to start thinking about how we can start caring for and considering the impact of climate change on non-human animals. But one possible logical progression from just this shift in our thinking is to move towards plant-based diets. So in this session, I have repeatedly made the case that the animal agricultural industry is implicated in climate change through greenhouse gas emissions. In my book, The War Against Non-Human Animals, I compare the environmental impacts of the dairy industry with plant-based alternatives to sort of really highlight the benefits of adopting a plant-based diet, plant-based diets. So I draw on literature empirical research by Ritchie, who compares several environmental metrics, so land use, greenhouse gas emissions, and water use, and found that dairy milk, so Ritchie in this research comparing those elements found that dairy milk, when compared to oat, soya, almond, and rice milk, scores higher across all metrics, as in it uses more land, it emits more greenhouse gases, and it uses more water. Based on her research, she states, dairy milk causes around 3 times as much greenhouse gas emissions, uses around 10 times as much land, 2 to 20 times as much fresh water. To put it another way, she states, a glass of dairy milk produced daily for a year uses 650 square meters of land. This is the equivalent of 2 tennis courts. And this is 10 times greater than what is required to produce the same quantity of oat milk. And while the production of plant-based milks does require relatively large amounts of water, for example, a glass of almond milk uses 130 pints of water, they still use less water than dairy milks. And then Kanyama et al. Extend the analysis beyond milk to make a comparison between the environmental impacts between a range of dairy products and plant-based alternatives. So they draw on 21 studies that compare the environmental impacts of dairy products with plant-based alternatives, so milk, butter, cream, and yogurt. The environmental metrics that they look at include greenhouse gas emissions, land, water, and energy use. And from a review of those 21 studies, they conclude that overall plant-based alternatives have a lower environmental impact than dairy products. So, to finish, I believe non-human animals are morally significant sentient beings who must be included in our ethical deliberations on the impacts of climate change. Our discussion around who is vulnerable to the impacts of climate change must include non-human animals. In my latest book, I develop an intersectional analysis of the relationship between anthropogenic climate change and atrocity crimes. In it, I focus on how race, gender, and speciesism, among other things, inform experiences and responses to the climate crisis. Relevant to what we are discussing here, I consider how speciesism and its ally human exceptionalism informs who and what is considered at risk of the environmental threats caused by climate change, and moreover, what types of measures are put in place to reduce or mitigate that risk. And here it's helpful, I think, to draw on the words of Almiron and Faraya, who state, we usually believe that we have a duty to help human beings suffering from natural harms or induced by climate change, such as disease, starvation, or natural catastrophes. If this is so, and speciesism, the unjustified, disadvantageous consideration of non-humans based on species membership, is to be rejected, then it follows that we have a similar duty to come to the aid of non-human animals in similar circumstances. So in sum, I think we should embrace this pluriversal worldview that I referred to earlier and celebrate and promote a reciprocal, intertwined and embedded relationship with ourselves and non-human animals. This forms part of a broader multi-species justice project. At its simplest, multi-species justice moves away from an anthropocentric version of justice towards a more inclusive blueprint of justice that treats all sentient beings as worthy of protection and respect. It is my hope that if we can agree on a crime of animal ecocide, this will go some way to protect non-human animals from the impacts of climate change. Indeed, it is this type of transformative change that forms the basis of the EU Horizon UKRI project that I am part of. This project is called Transformative Change for Biodiversity and Equity. And within that project, my role is to evaluate sustainability transformations through legal pathways such as rights of nature, ecocide, and restorative justice. And part of that will be to think about this idea of animal ecocide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banwell. We are now going to open up the chat for some questions and answers. So if you have questions, please post them here. I will read them off. That image of the bison was so striking. Yeah, anyway.
Yes, I use it on the front cover of the book, actually, just the skulls, because I think it's really evocative, isn't it?
It is very evocative, yeah. Okay, our first question. Thank you for such an insightful presentation. A question about legal standing. You described the potential to upgrade non-human animals' legal status from that of property to legal personhood, even for so-called cognitively advanced species like the chimps, orcas, and elephants, represented by the Non-Human Rights Project. Advancements are yet to be realized in the courts. There is another term being proposed in ecocide literature of natural persons, in contrast to judicial persons. What are your thoughts on that term, natural person, and its potential to encapsulate all living beings, both human and non-human?
That's a really great question. I've not come across that. I know I've been doing this, is it naturehood in personhood? I've been doing some other work around rights of nature about this idea of naturehood, but I've not come across that term. Natural, I can see the question, can't I? Natural
Natural
person.
persons. Yeah. So would that encapsulate both humans and non-human
Yes,
animals?
yeah, I
Yeah.
guess. And it would be, so what's the question? What are your thoughts? And its potential to encapsulate rather than being judicial. Yeah, I like it. I mean, as I say, I've not come across that term, but I'll certainly have a look and consider, yeah, whether that makes, because then you're then not having that distinction, I guess, between human and non-human animals. You're just, and it's a similar to this idea of naturehood. I believe that it's about, rather than trying to get non-human animals to reach a standard of humans, it's a term, I guess, that is more inclusive. Yeah, so yeah, I think that's great. And I might use that actually, Holly, because I think I'm going to be doing a session about the book. And I think this is something that I've sort of been thinking about since writing the book, about this idea of legal personhood. But yeah, I think that's a potential way forward in terms of this question around legal personhood. Thank you.
Oh, and she's provided a link there or
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
reference.
that looks
Yeah.
great. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. That is really
Yeah, that is,
fascinating.
yes. Yeah, I will. This is what's great about doing these sorts of sessions, that you get sort of references and ideas from people. But that's fantastic. Yeah, because it would link in exactly what I'm talking about here. Thanks, Holly.
I'm compelled by the references that you've cited to describing the logistics of what it would look like for captive animals on factory farms to all be released. I'm very curious about how people have thought through that. Yeah.
Yeah, they're really interesting. I think the first person that I referenced, what was really fascinating about his article is he was saying that once we do that, there'll be even more animals that we have to consider, because the ones that are being harmed and killed as a result of the animal industrial complex, what do we do about those? Because that would be an additional population that we'd have to consider, which I thought was really interesting. But yeah, I can share those with you because I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that. Okay, from Rob Amos. Really interesting talk, Stacy. We need to find time for a coffee while I'm still at Greenwich. My issue with the crime of ecocide is that it is retaliatory. In other words, it punishes individuals for harms already committed. Do you think there would be greater value in developing rights of nature approaches, which are already evolving in different legal and social contexts, which could have greater value in preventing harms?
Fantastic. Thanks, Robin. Yes, we must try and grab a coffee whilst you're still at Greenwich. Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and that speaks to exactly what I've been doing on the transformative change project. So one of the things that we've just done, we've just written an article where we are evaluating different legal levers, and we've sort of created these tables about how transformative these different pathways can be. And so one of the things that we do in that article is talk about rights of nature and how that is possibly the most transformative, and speaks to what you've put here in the question. But also, I think what we have said is that with ECOS, one of the things that we do for each of them is look at restorative justice as well, and how restorative justice alongside rights of nature and environmental courts seems to offer the best way forward with this. So I think we talk about, and as I said today, that there is the potential with ecocide, but I think unfortunately at the moment it is still has that kind of inherent anthropocentrism, but also, as you say, it kind of, punishes individuals from harms that have already been committed, but also possibly punishes the wrong people as well. So yeah, I agree. I think the rights of nature is the way forward. I think, again, though, the problem with some of that is this enforcement issue, and looking at various countries that have adopted that. I did a case study looking at the Amazon and cases where it has been used, but then again, you look 3 years down the line and that behavior has resumed. So yeah, I think it's a better approach, but there are still those issues around enforcement. But yeah, it'd be great to catch up, Rob, and hear your thoughts about all of that.
From Holly again. This is similar to Rob's question regarding how global panels like the International Criminal Court are addressing ecocide. If this progresses and court cases could in time be brought against identified offenders, such as large industries like fossil fuel or the meat and dairy industries, I wonder if you have any comments on how you might envision what the penalties would be and whether they would have any effect on existing behavior. Familiar examples already under environmental law are mining corporations polluting waterways, but they accept and absorb any resulting penalties they must pay into just the cost of doing business. It's a question that looks ahead past your current work, but would you have any comments on how ecocide cases might have enough teeth to change behavior on the global stage?
Brilliant, thanks, Holly. Yeah, and again, these are great questions, because this is exactly what we've written about in this article. I think the conclusion we come to is that ecocide would work if we sort of rethink the definition and look at that wantonness element, but it would sort of have to work alongside this idea of restorative justice. And I know that there was a mock panel, wasn't there, that the independent expert panel conducted, where they invited all of those who may be involved. So there was a mock court case where they had Indigenous and place-based peoples, and they had various people involved in that, and everybody came together to try and work through how it might look in practice. And I think that was quite promising. But again, it was done in the context of restorative justice, where you have victims, perpetrators all come together. And in the same way that restorative justice works outside of environmental courts, that process seems to be the best approach, where you have both, perpetrators or those being found guilty of the crime of ecocide with those most impacted. So I think that was the conclusion we came to, was that it would only work with that kind of revision to that definition, but in an environmental court alongside, restorative justice. So yeah, that was where we got to.
So fascinating. Holly said, thank you. That's really interesting. Yeah.
And so once it's still under review, the article that we submitted. So once it's, hopefully, if it's accepted for publication, I will be able to share that, because it really required. We had one of our PhD students at Greenwich, a law student, sort of help us work through it all, because it required a lot of thinking in terms of, what do we mean by transformative change, and then trying to work through these different legal levers that we've got. So yeah, that was our conclusion.
So fascinating. Thank you. From Ken Hopkins, great to see the criminality outlined in animal agriculture, but with its already behind the curtain approach, is there any concern of driving industry deeper into keeping practices secret?
Good question, yeah. So is the question, I guess, that if we criminalize or further kind of criminalize, then it kind of, yeah. And I think that's to a certain extent, that's what a lot of people say, that they find that some of it, that it's even now that people just don't know or can't see what's happening. But yeah, I guess that is a concern.
Yeah, the egg gag
Yes,
in
yeah.
Canada is under a Senate review right now. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's talk about modifications. Yeah. From Chris Kevorkian, we're struggling in Washington State with our bill recognizing the inherent rights of the southern resident orcas, since some are suggesting we should not use a rights of nature framework, while legislators tell us not to mention personhood because the religious right seems to be co-opting that term as it relates to fetal personhood. Interesting. Any
Yeah,
thoughts or suggestions? Hoping for
gosh.
help.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? I'm just reading the question again.
Yeah.
I think, as I say, I need to find this term. Whilst I'll just have a quick look as we're talking. The term that we used was this idea of its naturehood rather than legal personhood. So that might be one way around this idea of a sort of almost ascribing or attaching, a bit like the natural person's suggestion above, this idea of, but I think this is more in relation, let me just read the question again. This is in relation more to non-human animals, but that was another approach that we came across, this idea of naturehood. I'll just try and, yeah, rather, again, going back to what I was saying earlier about not trying to use something that is based on humans, but trying to sort of get human. I guess it goes back to what I was saying earlier about these bio and ecocentric worldviews, that you are trying to sort of not see humans as superior. So I would suggest that this work, I can find the reference of the person who wrote a really interesting article about applying naturehood to persons rather than legal personhood to non-human animals. And that might certainly help with you not, as you says, the question says, not sort of using this rights of nature framework, but also not using that term because of that kind of potential crossover with the religious right. So that could be a solution. And I don't know if I can send that to you, Liz or Holly, but there was a really interesting article around that I'm happy to share with people about that
That's
other
great.
approach.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, Holly manages the listserv for the ASRI, so
Okay,
she'd
so
be
yeah,
great
I'll share
contact.
that because
Yeah,
I think it's a really interesting approach that speaks exactly to that question of people not really wanting to do the legal personhood and struggling with the rights of nature. So yeah, I'm happy to share that sort of third way, if you like, this naturehood.
that's great. Thank you. Yeah, Chris says, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, that question says a lot about the political and cultural context of this work too, in
Yes.
certain areas. Yeah, yeah. Um, okay. We have a little bit more time if there's any other questions coming up here. Delaney says, would be very interested in that article too, please, and loving these questions. Yeah.
Yes, I will. Yeah, I'll send those, yeah, send the article that we're doing about these legal levers, but also this one around nature. And I'm almost certainly getting it wrong. You know, and you sort of think I'm saying naturehood, but that's not, I don't think that's it. Let me yes, no, yeah, it was naturehood. I had got it right. Yeah, so it says naturehood involves new understandings of the proper balance between humans and other members of Earth life systems. So it draws upon indigenous peoples and other relational and animist philosophies which respect spirituality, value, and the interdependent nature of life. So yeah, and I think it was Garver who came up with this and said it sort of needed, so it's, yeah, this idea of granting naturehood to people, um, which, yeah, seemed like a sort of, yeah, spoke more to this pluriversal approach. So yeah, instead of incorporating rights that give nature legal personhood, ecological law should ultimately be about adopting principles and rules that give people naturehood in law.
Mm.
So you're shifting it around, I guess, and sort of focusing, no, it's us as humans that should then be getting, should be given naturehood in law rather than the other way around. So I think that could be something that speaks to some of the questions that people have had here about, the tension between rights of nature and legal personhood.
Very interesting. Yeah. Another question from Rob. This is in response to Chris's question. Hope you don't mind, Stacy. I have recently done some work on protecting orca cultures, with rights of nature being one avenue that we explore. Focusing on orca cultures rather than individual animals per se may avoid the personhood issue.
Fantastic. No, thank you, Rob. That's great. I don't mind at all. And that's interesting for me to think about that as well. I mean, it's great, isn't it? Because I think, like with anything, there's so many discussions and debates about all of these things, but I think the positive is that we are having these discussions. There are efforts and attempts to recognize, the importance of nature and non-human animals, and to give rights and to sort of embrace this multi-speciesist approach. So I think we always seem to get stuck in some of, these debates as academics, don't we? But I think it's, for me, the positive is that we are having these discussions in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. From Manisha Decca, thank you so much for being here. Just wondering, is sentience a baseline for which animals might be able to come under the definition of ecocide, or could we do away with sentience and also include non-sentient animals?
Yeah, I think we can, because I think one of the things that I've been looking at is this idea of vulnerability, this concept, because it's constantly used. You read so many different reports around climate change, and often the word that is used in terms of people and their exposure and disproportionate impacts is this idea of vulnerability. So I think that perhaps, that notion of vulnerability could be used in place of this idea of sentience.
And so vulnerability in terms of survival, perhaps, rather than awareness or
or just that, that we, because again, if we think about when we're talking about human populations, we look at some of these policy documents that we have, like the one that I quoted during the lecture, we don't sort of start thinking about, well, which humans are deserving of that human rights approach when we think about, we talk about kind of vulnerabilities and things. So I'm wondering if a similar thing could apply here, that we, use the same categories, location, when we think about that intersectional approach, in terms of humans and their exposure to climate change, perhaps we could use a similar metrics when we're thinking about non-human animals. But it certainly wouldn't necessarily. I think the reason I talk about that is that I think that if you can get people on, it's easier to get people on board to say, if you can recognize that most non-human animals are sentient beings, they do feel pain, they do suffer. It gets people on board. But equally, I don't think anyone's saying that we shouldn't be trying to protect all humans from, the impacts of climate change. And we don't sort of only think about those people who are able to feel pain. So I think a similar approach could apply to non-human animals.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that, Stacy. So we just have a couple more minutes. Any further questions, comments from the audience? Okay, so I think if it's all right with you, Dr. Banwell, I think we're going to wrap up. Any last comments that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
I don't think, just thank you for the questions. They're really helpful, and it was always good to get some new ideas. So thank you.
Okay, Colby's saying very interesting presentation and discussion. Thank you so much. Lots of thank yous in the chat coming in.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Banwell, and also to the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights, Law and Policy for funding this lecture series. It's been so great having you join us today. Thank you also to our co-presenters at the University of Victoria, the Faculty of Law, Departments of Political Science and Environmental Studies, and the Center for Global Studies. Next up in our Distinguished Lecture Series, join us in the new year, January 21st, when Professor of Law Margot Mitchell, who I believe is here with us today, which is great, from the University of Zurich, will present under the title Eroding Boundaries Between Humans and Animals and Their Legal Implications. Professor Mitchell is also co-founder and co-director of the Center for Animal Law and Ethics at the University of Zurich. If you'd like to stay up to date on all upcoming events and news, and you're not already on our monthly newsletter list, just email Holly at the link provided at the top of the program, and we'd love to have you involved in the Animals in Society Research Initiative through the University of Victoria. So thank you again, Dr. Banwell. It's been so lovely spending time with you today. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. Take care.
Everyone.